when caring for patients, particularly whether it's the person actively dying or their loved one, loss starts happening, and the emotions associated with that loss, which is grief, starts happening from the time the diagnosis on.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Beyond the Manuscript. I am your host, Cooper Anderson, and before we get into it today, I just want to say that Beyond the Manuscript is now available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, if you like what I do here, hit that like and subscribe button just for me, please. It really helps out the channel. Okay, now let's get into it. My guest today was educated at the University of Kansas School of Medicine and trained at the Medical University of South Carolina and the Harvard Fellowship in Palliative Care, Education, and Practice. She has been in the world of healthcare for over 20 years with MedPeds training and board certification in the subspecialty of hospice and palliative medicine. She is a physician and healthcare delivery consultant serving in various roles as a clinician, educator, administrator, and innovator nationally and internationally. She works with various organizations dedicated to fostering innovative approaches to closing health and education disparities across the globe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Clark. How are we doing today, Jennifer?
Hi, Cooper. How are you? That was very sweet.
It was a lot of very, very impressive qualifications that I was very happy that I could actually say and pronounce correctly, thanks to your wonderful guidance earlier. So you and I, we actually met here at Manuscripts, where I was your positioning specialist for your soon upcoming book that you're currently in the midst of writing at the moment, right?
Yes. Yeah, very exciting. Very exciting
Awesome.
opportunity, especially, to be in a community of practice with other writers and experts. For those of us who don't know how to write, it's just a gem of a place to be. So,
Yeah. Awesome. So to kind of just jump right into it, please tell us about the book that you're currently writing.
sounds good. To put it bluntly, because it's a bit blunt right up the front, is really talking about our need to suffer, particularly suffering as humans. Like death, as a hospice and palliative medicine physician, I've had to deal with death and overcoming the taboos of death, particularly in the discussions here in the United States. And similar to death, suffering has a bad rap. And so
Mhm.
the book is actually a reflection of an odd crossroads in my professional life. As you said, I'm a MedPeds trained physician, means I'm an internist and a pediatrician. And I went into that primary training to take care of people across an age continuum, and particularly understanding the concept of human development and really about self-actualization and flourishing, and how do we do that. And during my training, I found that caring for the seriously ill actually allowed me into the places where I wanted to ask those developmental questions, and particularly caring for young adults who are facing a serious illness and some of them facing their own mortality. I was able to see this profound dichotomous split almost between that population of people, where some of them went on to be these wildly self-actualized human beings despite their chronological age. And I saw some of them regress back to childlike behaviors. And I was just struck with that question, kind of why and how has that come to be? And through that work and 20 years of practice, this book around suffering really reflects how our suffering is actually the pathway to self-actualization and potentially, kind of the potential of human development. And so, really giving space to my patients and my colleagues and my friends and families as teachers, and the lessons they have taught me, in the profound need for suffering and how we can harness its power to be better humans.
Amazing stuff, really, because all the conversations we had during positioning was really, really cool. Can you go into a little bit more detail on how you specifically fell into this particular subspecialty of medicine?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. I don't get to talk about it very often, so thank you for asking. Um, I came to medicine late, actually. I have a degree in business, undergraduate, and I worked actually and actually needed that time to develop on my own and really figure out what I was put on this earth for. And through some wild circumstances, found myself at the doorstep of medicine. Oddly, I come from a family of nurses and physicians, so it wasn't too terribly odd, but it was, kind of full circle, maybe kind of coming back to families of origin. And I was ready, really ready for that, to engage in the most vulnerable time of people's lives. When our health is kind of threatened, our basic human need for safety kind of really demonstrates and kind of reveals kind of who we are, kind of essentially at our nature. And so I found myself early in my training, even in the first and second year of medical school, really drawn to narrative ethics and bioethics and complex medical decision making, and really understanding the who's, whys, and hows of people's kind of approach to their own mortality. At the time, the practice of palliative medicine didn't exist. Hospice was there, but
Mhm.
it didn't come to light until my early training years. So my intern year and my second year of residency at MUSC, where I was introduced to this new subspecialty. So it didn't come in, hospice and palliative medicine as a subspecialty wasn't founded until 2008. People have been practicing without board certification, but it became officially as a subspecialty of medicine in 2008. And I was fortunately
Mm.
one of the very first ones to kind of take advantage of that, and was trained by my mentors at Harvard and across the country as kind of the second generation of palliative medicine physicians to come into the globe. But it was this, at the heart of it was really, why are people the way they are, and how does illness really influence that? The healthcare system is really a monolith to disease, and
Mhm.
as a diagnostician, I was really interested in disease, but more interested in how the disease sits within someone's life versus
Mhm.
the disease in and of itself. And so my practice allows me to kind of go into that, because much of my work is helping people come to terms with incorporating the disease as part of their identity so they can live their lives no matter how much time they have left. And so, yeah, so it was through that interest in human development that got me into med peds. And then the place where development and disease can be chatted about together simultaneously as an expectation of a practice is where palliative medicine came into play.
Yeah, so this again, this is a really, like you said, it's brand new, or
Yeah.
in terms of medicine, right?
Yeah.
And so for the people who are not in medicine, like such as myself and a lot of other people, what would you say is like the best way to like approach such a heavy topic? And more importantly, for your book, how do you make this not even just palatable for people who might find this kind of subject a little uncomfortable, but how do you make it engaging as well? Like, what's your strategy for this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Storytelling,
Hmm.
bottom line. People, it's really funny because initially when you say the word suffer, it's like there's this, people become verklempt and a little, kind of
Yeah, they clam up and we're like,
just
oh, like, these are, yeah.
yeah, they get, in our world we call that dyspeptic. And but it's an interesting paradox. They really want to talk about it. And
Hmm.
so it's this kind of thing, is it really palatable? Yeah, because, kind of everyone suffers.
Yeah.
Everyone, kind of, and we suffer in silence oftentimes, right? We
Mm.
we have this now, particularly with social media, this whole need to put on a show that everybody's happy. And
Hmm.
if there's a word that I would love to abolish in the English language, it would be happy, because it has caused so much unnecessary suffering, particularly in the
Hmm.
framework of social media, that if you're not aesthetically pleasing, having a good time toasting margaritas on the coastline of Mexico.
While being extremely wealthy
Right,
beyond.
right, right.
Yeah.
That
Mhm.
somehow you have failed in life.
Yeah.
And that's not the reality of things. People suffer on a routine basis. And it's everything, kind of, and one of the biggest things that I talk about in the book, and one of the things that people really struggle with, is that suffering has a problem of language.
Mhm.
So when you think of suffering, everybody typically thinks of physical pain
Mhm.
or loss. Those are events that happen to all of us
Mhm.
humans. It happens regardless. We are going to come into events in our lives that are uncomfortable. What this book really talks about is the suffering of that suffering. It's what we make meaning of. It's the experience. It's the emotions, feelings, sensations
Mhm.
that we have in response to those events. And that's where things get kind of, we get into trouble. And one of the things interesting is that there's a common human pattern to suffering. And
Mm.
when people are given that normalizing experience and knowing that they're not alone,
Mhm.
there's this opening to it that allows them to go through it versus the constant resistance that we typically have in experiencing things like fear and
Mhm.
ignorance and shame and isolation and the other basic sufferings that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, you mentioned in the thing that you actually sent me on how you were going to break down this book on how one subject, like where it's like someone's particular need isn't being met, which leads to
Mhm.
this kind of suffering, which lead to
Right.
that lack of this need, which is going to lead to that kind of suffering, and how it's this one kind of big domino effect that goes down the line there.
Yeah, I mean, that was the one beautiful thing about my two different types of training, that all of a sudden I was like, oh, these two patterns actually match.
Mhm.
So what I was seeing, kind of as a palliative care physician, kind of, that's such a crazy word. It means to palliate, it's to shield. My
Mm.
job as a palliative care physician, as part of a palliative care team, is to mitigate suffering. I mean, that's our job. Physical suffering, psychological suffering, spiritual suffering, whatever it happens to be. And so I got really good at identifying, as a diagnostician, the patterns of suffering. Well, as someone who was interested in human development, I was like, this parallels Maslow's hierarchy of need.
Mhm.
So when you look at our basic fundamental needs, there's a modernized version of Maslow's needs that I'll get into in the book, that has been best elucidated by Scott Barry Kaufman. Is that this, kind of the basic patterns, 6 patterns of suffering, mirror this, kind of our basic needs gone unmet. So
Mhm.
when people ask me, can you give me one definition of suffering? I say, oh, it's a chronically unmet basic need.
Mm. Yeah.
And so the book really goes into those needs, the suffering of those needs, and what the satisfaction of those needs also look like, so that people then can easily navigate, oh, this event in my life that has come is affecting my basic need for safety,
Mhm.
or my basic need for self-esteem,
Mhm.
or is challenging my growth need of love and purpose. So it gives
Yeah.
people language, which is important, as
Mhm.
you know, as a writer, right? Because
Oh yeah.
sometimes if we don't have a language or a story that make meaning, it becomes kind of
It becomes an
endless.
amalgamous thing of which is usually, especially in storytelling, way scarier than
Yeah,
actually giving a name to something or context or something like that. You know, if you watch
right,
any kind of scary movie, it's the part before you see the monster that everyone's terrified of because
right.
you only see like the aftermath
Yeah.
rather than the actual monster itself.
Well, that gives a perfect example of, kind of, a lot of our needs are based in just kind of the fact that there are certain conditions in this world by which we have to live with, and one of them is chaos. One of
Yeah.
them is that things are constantly changing, and as a result, our lowest brain is rooted and wired for negativity bias. It's about
Mm,
basic survival. So we're constantly looking for the bad things to happen. And worst case scenario is the first thing that comes out. And what this does is allow you to see, yes, that is one pathway, but there are so many other possibilities. And it opens that perspective and moves you out of that lower part of our brain into the higher functioning levels of our brain in order for us to better reason and relate to that experience in a way that mitigates the suffering and our response to said event.
Gotcha.
So.
Very cool. And so you mentioned before that the way that you really want to broach this subject with the public is
Mhm.
through storytelling. Do you have any major stories that stick out in your head that you really want to put in this book? But they could be negative or positive or both if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of amalgamations of patients. Obviously, we always have to be careful about self-identification and making sure those patient stories are
HIPAA
definitely
protected, stuff like that?
protected. Yeah,
Yeah.
HIPAA is what we call it here in the States. And so, um, so the stories of that dichotomous split, right, that I talked about, particularly with the young adults that I've cared for, or even some kids that I
Mhm.
have cared for, that demonstrate this profound self-actualization and what that looks like, and being able to bear witness to that profound development occurring in front of my eyes.
Mhm.
It will be stories around that. It will be specific stories around the suffering transformation that I saw, which with each one of these, taking care of patients in profound fear as they faced a
Mhm.
traumatic, experience, or those who sat with me in their own longing to make sense of their own
Mm.
experiences, and what those different conversations are like, so that people then understand and can relate to their own specific experiences, because all of these
Mhm.
needs are within us at any given time. One of the fallacies of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is like a video game. You get one, you go to the next, you go to the next, you go to the next, and that's not the case. We're constantly managing all of our basic needs at any given time, and though they fall into kind of growth category versus a deficit kind of category that we'll go into in our book, at any given time, despite your life's experiences, you could be challenged with your basic safety needs. All it takes
Mhm.
is a car accident to kind of
Yeah,
bring
exactly.
you right
Yeah.
back down. And so,
Mhm.
learning to navigate and know internally, oh gosh, this is really challenging my basic need for connection, despite the fact that you may have really strong relationships. And so,
Mm.
again, we tend to not want to pay attention to the lower needs because we don't like to kind of acknowledge that we're fragile, or that we're dependent upon others, or, the little ego, the little voice in our head, the critic that, giving people language around that, giving people understanding what the neurobiology is of that, the things they have control over and not control over, so that they can rest back and say, oh, okay, I don't have to go down this road of negativity bias and, worst case scenario. These are the other options, opening to what my artist friends call the terrible sublime,
Mm.
meaning that life's beauty is being able to see all options, see its full beauty, the
Mhm.
ugliness, and kind of the profound awe and wonder, and things like that. And so it allows people again to rest in language, stories that are relatable to day-to-day life, so that they can fully see and embrace the full spectrum of what it
Yeah.
means to be human, and not just the happy, or, happy, mad, sad is typically the only what people can
You
you know,
comprehend. Yeah.
live. And it's more of this integrated, complete, whole life that allows you to, kind of flow instead of resist, kind of
Mm.
the constant change, and
Gotcha.
impermanence that's inherent to life.
Is
So.
that very apparent when you're helping out some of your patients where they're and I know it's a very basic kind of thing of like where like people are going through like the 5 stages of grief, but like I know the first one is like denial. Is that one really, and I'm assuming that's just more of like a self-defense mechanism of like there's no way I have, terminal cancer or some other kind of disease. Like does that happen a lot in your line of work?
Oh my gosh, it's so funny you bring that up. So very similar to Maslow, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who laid out what
Yeah.
is termed the 5 stages of grief.
And yeah, and I know that's not based on any like real hard science kind of, or there's a it's not a hard or fast definition. Like you're not okay, now they're clearly in this stage, now they're clearly in the next stage, and they're never going to go back at all. I know that's not how it is, but
Yeah.
in basic terms, how does it goes? It goes like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay,
So, and they're not stages, they're actually phenomenon that come
gotcha.
and
Okay,
go during the experience of grief,
yeah.
right? And so when caring for patients, particularly whether it's the person actively dying or their loved one, loss starts happening and the emotions associated with that loss, which is grief, starts happening from the time of diagnosis on.
Hmm.
And one thing I always tell people is that you must feel grief in
Hmm.
order to grieve.
Yeah.
So
The,
people
the
who
only way through it is to go through it.
go through it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, denial is one of our strongest coping mechanisms. It allows us to get through the acute trauma of
Mm,
loss, if you
mm,
will. But then at some point, just like any adaptive coping mechanism, it becomes maladaptive.
mhm,
And so helping people chip away at their denial and little bit by little bit start moving towards acceptance
mhm.
of the circumstance, whether they like it or not, kind of
Yeah.
allows kind of what denial does is it protects us from an emotional experience that we're under prepared for.
Prepared for. Right.
And so once we're out of that acute trauma, we can help people chip away at the denial and allow little bit by little bit the emotional overwhelm that sometimes the complexity of grief can bring.
Mhm,
Because as you said, you get tidal waves of the paradoxical experience of ferocious joy. Like you're so angry, but yet there's this infusion of joy, and you're like, what do I do with this? There's
mhm,
guilt, remorse, regret, sadness, and when we look at people who are experiencing grief and particularly the suffering of grief, it's even more hard because our brain chemistry is completely different. It basically takes our social ability to connect to others completely offline, which is one
mhm.
of the reasons why we cry during grief. It's not so much sadness, it's just that we cannot express in language that
Mm,
we need people. So our tears
yeah.
call others to us.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. So my next question is, who are you hoping to help slash educate the most with this book? Because I feel like there's a ton of people who either would definitely find this fascinating subject matter to read about, but who are you hoping to really help out?
The lay public,
Mm,
actually, and when I say the lay public, that also includes my colleagues. One
mhm,
of the biggest rewards I have as a clinician when I'm in the hospital or in a clinical setting is obviously the direct patient care and caring for, kind of the person in the bed and the people surrounding them. But what got lost, particularly in the pandemic, and something that gets lost in healthcare in general, is that those of us who are caregivers are also human beings as well. And we have our own loss and we have our
mm,
own grief.
yeah.
And we aren't trained, we don't miraculously understand that when we get an MD or an RN or a DO stamped behind our name. Frankly, the hidden curriculum, particularly in medical training, is to ignore that. Like you just put that in a box and put it away. That's not for
Mhm,
you to kind of deal with. And it's not until the last decade through the practice of palliative medicine, have we come to understand the suffering of caregiving. And so this book is not only for my patients, colleagues, and friends, it's for those caregivers that are out there that have never been given the language to process their own
mm,
experience so they can be readily prepared to care for others in their human experience. So it's targeted towards a lay audience, and that's largely kind of in the last years of my practice has been around public education because suffering and death don't belong in the hospital.
mhm.
They belong in our communities where we live and what we do and how
Yeah.
we live and who we live with on a day-to-day basis. So,
Sure. It's one of those, universal experiences that everyone alive will eventually like go through.
yeah.
And it's important to kind of I don't know if preparing is even the right word for that, but an acceptance that it's going to happen to all of us at some point, and that's going to be okay. We're all going to try to get through this together a little bit.
Yeah, it's re-inviting
There you go.
those
That's there. See,
experiences.
this is why I invite you on, because you're way smarter at talking than I am. But yeah, I like that, re-inviting people to kind of explore the subject for sure.
Yeah, because kind of if we're going to change the way we live and how healthcare particularly serves us as consumers, if we don't want to, kind of our healthcare system isn't like I said, a monolith to disease. You have to
Mhm.
have a disease in order to get in there. We keep asking healthcare
Mm,
to
mm,
be something that it's really not.
mhm,
You know, flourishing and health promotion and resilience beyond the rescue and recovery of the current healthcare system belongs in our homes, in our
mhm,
communities, in our in our gathering places. The problem is because we've moved illness and death into the healthcare system, we've lost that communal conversation around suffering and its ultimate outcome of death, and really reinvigorating those conversations so we can support ourselves in that development towards the very end. And so, yeah, it's reinvigorating those words within community so that we can support each other through our entire human development towards collective self-actualization. So,
very cool. And kind of my last question for the day
sure.
is, what advice would you give someone who is currently in hospice or has a loved one in hospice?
Be present. Um, you know, anytime I teach particularly young people who have not experienced death directly, or the only experience they have is maybe the loss of a pet and things like that,
Mhm,
is that dying is being with the dying, particularly,
mhm,
um, is a profound experience. And if you can understand and accept your fear, not get rid of it. Fear is an important thing. It means there's something important you have to pay attention to, right?
mhm,
um, that holding your fear, being fully present with the person, not having to do anything, but just to be present with them. The unfolding of what the dying actually teach us can be revealed to you. And when those of us who care for the dying are able to foster deep conversation between the ones that are dying and the ones that are remaining behind, loved ones and otherwise, that transference of knowledge and wisdom is really powerful to watch. And so, it's okay to be afraid. Fear means that something important is coming, but hold that fear in presence, right? Be
mhm.
fully present with the person, and work with your hospice agency to learn what it means to go through dying, because we have universal experiences of things all the way up into this profound ability for what we call terminal lucidity, where we're able to kind of be able to see the world in a much, much different perspective in the moments prior to death. And so be present is all I tell everyone. Dying is the most creative adventure of a human life, and you don't want to miss out on it.
Excellent advice. All right. And while we're wrapping up here for today, Dr. Jennifer Clark, where can people find your stuff online?
Yeah, so I just have a small website kind of with my contact information and basic thoughts around this and other things like opening to mortality and the gift of choosing, which is the name of the website. So thegiftofchoosing.com.
Good. And there's going to be links to that directly below in our description here,
Perfect.
folks. All right, everyone, that is going to be it for today's episode of Beyond the Manuscript, powered by Manuscripts. You're never going to write alone. I want to thank my guest one more time, Dr. Jennifer Clark, for coming on to the show today. If you like the show, if you'd like to support us here, please hit that like and subscribe button down below. And one more time, Dr. Jennifer Clark, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Cooper.